I'm very pleased to have with me today Minnesota's 3rd District Congressman Dean Phillips. Welcome, Congressman.
Good to be with you, Steve.
As we're doing this, two things I'd like you to react to that are just popping now. I don't know if you are like me. I am never surprised, but I am constantly astonished when I read whatever it is I'm reading in the morning. And so there's this quote by Kevin McCarthy analyzing the situation playing out in the House of Representatives. And he basically says, I can't believe it. You know, there's just people here who just want to burn the place down. And I absorbed that, ponder it for a second. And I've known him for a long time. I've known him since he was in the California legislature. So my reaction to that is, well, no shit, Kevin. Right? Better late than never. Eureka. What's your reaction to that? Are you astonished that came out of his mouth?
Well, I have to say, Steve, that first of all, I wouldn't wish his job right now on my worst enemy. I mean, it's an almost unwinnable, irretractable circumstance in which he finds himself. But to your question, no, astonished but not surprised. And I look back at Speaker Pelosi's tenure and the way that she kind of laid down the law with those who might disrupt her agenda early. I think made somewhat clear her position, got the rest of the caucus and my side, the conference, of course, on the GOP to understand the game plan. And she was awfully effective. You don't have to agree with her policy or her approach, but in terms of leadership, frankly, one of the best I've ever seen. McCarthy's in a very different circumstance, but I do think it's fair to say that without establishing A, trust, B, the game plan, and whose side you're really on early, you've got ambiguity, and we're seeing that right now. And not only is it a detriment to the GOP, which I think, like you, I want to see a principled conservative party in America. We don't have that right now. And I think he missed an opportunity, sadly, to establish his leadership and now finds himself both sacrificing his party, but more importantly, the country.
The second thing is that as we're doing this, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from my home state of New Jersey has been indicted on multiple counts of corruption, basic bribery, and all of these things. But within the indictment is that he is doing favors for cash from the chairmanship of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the government of Egypt. Your reaction?
I'm appalled. I mean, Steve, how can you look at any of this evidence, see the report, see the indictment, and not be appalled? And I say time and time again, I don't give a hoot about your politics. I do care about your principles. And I don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican. I think it's appalling. He's got every right to remain innocent until proven guilty. This is round 2 for him. What I've seen in this indictment is disgusting. I personally think he should resign. I would expect if this was reversed and it was a Democrat, I'm sure my colleagues on the other side would expect that. And as someone who served on the House Ethics Committee for 2 terms, Steve, and found it disappointing how poorly resourced and poorly effective we were, how the lack of effectiveness is really disappointing. And I don't think we have internal mechanisms to hold people accountable. I think George Soros, I always say George Soros, that he's in the news too often. Santos, George Santos.
You're not alone. You're not alone in mixing those two up.
I wonder why.
All the time in writing. They obviously have nothing to do with one another, but
well, some would have us believe they do, which is the more interesting conversation maybe for later. But George Santos, he should have resigned. The speaker should have encouraged that, because if we're going to restore faith in government, which I know is a shared interest of yours and mine and most people in America, it starts with holding people accountable. And yes, he's going to step down from the Foreign Relations Committee as chairman because that's a Senate rule. But my goodness, I think it's time to resign and turn that seat over to somebody more principled.
In January of 1960, and I wrote about this today, John Kennedy gives a speech, and it's about the presidency in 1960. And he offers a philosophical frame on it. And in the end, he tells a story about Abraham Lincoln. And he says that the Lincoln model is much to his liking. And he tells the story of Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln says to those around him as he's signing it that if he is remembered for anything, it will be this. And he wants them to know that his whole heart is in it, and that if his hand trembled, people will say that he hesitated as he signed this, which I think is a rupture in history, a profound moment of importance in the United States. And Kennedy concludes this speech by saying, but his hand did not waver, for he was the president of the United States. We have an election where 3/4 of the country is saying, don't want it. Now, we have a politics where the media, such as it is, and I'm being overly broad in describing it, but tells the American people the country is hopelessly divided and evenly divided. Well, that's not true. I'll give you 3 examples. One is immigration, 2 is guns, and the third is what they want as a choice in the election. Now, you have 2 political parties that the American people are told never agree with each other on anything. Yet, they seem to be in agreement that you're going to get what you get and like what you get. My question is, how do you think that works out, not from a partisan perspective, but from a sociological perspective, as someone I know who is an acute observer of the American character?
So I reflect back on President Washington's farewell address. I know you know it well, and probably many watching right now. And he shared with this new nation that his grave concerns were factions, which were political parties, which of course did not exist when he was president, and regionalism, which, by the way, we've got an urban-rural divide in this country that is dangerous, and also foreign interference. And look at all 3, 200 and some years later, all at the forefront. And frankly, our duopoly, our political industrial complex, as I call it, is to me antithetical to the pure representational democracy that I think our founders really intended. They were mortified about political parties. I don't think they ever envisioned there would be a duopoly like we have now. And to your point, it seems that the powers that be on both sides of the aisle agree on one thing and one thing only, and that is perpetuating the status quo. I think regularly, Steve, about whether or not it's time for competition. I've argued publicly, I think the Democratic bench should rise right now and provide competition in a primary. It's healthy, provides better product at better value. It doesn't matter if it's people or a consumer product. That's the truth. I also think both parties could use a little bit of competition. Right now, we have this dynamic that you know well. There's magnetism to the corners, and only a third party that could triangulate power to some degree could push us to the middle. And as a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress, I think that's a good example. 32 Democrats, 32 Republicans, that serves somewhat as that magnet for the middle. You know, we don't operate like a party. I wish we did more often. But that's, I think, what the country needs. That's what I think the country is begging for. And I believe only recently, in the first time in modern history, have those who consider themselves independent been more numerous than those who identify as Democrats and Republicans. That does not mean that they will vote for an independent candidate immediately for president, but it surely means that they're disgusted with the system and frankly understand why.
Joe Scarborough said something on Morning Joe a week or so back that is very true. Now, there was a behavior amongst Republicans that I watched from the green room, that I watched from the television sets during my decade as an analyst at MSNBC. And it was people saying one thing off camera and the complete opposite on camera, and then watching that metastasize over the 7-year basis into an unbending, unyielding cult of personality, where you are required, if you're a member of such cult of personality, to submit what is true, right? Your own intellectual agency and sovereignty, right? Goes through the prism of, well, the leader will tell you what's true, what's real. Joe Scarborough says it's not a single Democrat, which is true, who comes on air ever, not one, who, after praising Biden as the greatest president since FDR, doesn't, as soon as that camera goes off, say, I'm really worried. I don't think he can win. What do you say about that? And do you get the cynicism that injects into the system?
Damn right. 5 years ago, before I was serving in Congress, I was one of those cynics. I was becoming appalled at what I sensed was exactly what is occurring. By the way, Joe can only say that because he has not had me on his show yet. I think I'm the only Democrat that has said the quiet part out loud. You can imagine, not only is there no reward, it's a damn good way to end a career in politics, particularly with our two-party system. But I feel compelled to speak the truth, because the reason I did this in the first place was I was tired of watching the same thing you're just describing. It's not unique to one party or the other. It's a disease. It's a disease of authenticity, of truth. And frankly, for we Democrats, I think it's even more important. I think the bar should be a little bit higher for us, because we're emerging as the party of truth, one of the only party of truth right now in the country. And that's why I think on questions like Senator Menendez, on questions like, not what do you think of Joe Biden? I think Joe Biden's a wonderful, compassionate, decent, competent man. I think his administration did a fine job of being the bridge that he promised. That's a different question, what you think of the president, what you think of his policy, then what do you think about the future? I just look at the numbers just like you do, Steve, and it's so clear. And I don't know how Americans can comport their representatives who see the same numbers, live in their same communities, hear the same conversations, and yet are unwilling to simply say it when there's a light on and a camera lens open. And look, if you can't do it then, of course, if you're an American citizen, you think they're probably not telling the truth about anything. And that is part of this crisis that I think we're facing in our country. And we need leaders on both sides of the aisle to emerge who are willing to say the truth. We also need a political reward for it. That's the problem right now, Steve. Why would people pursue something that would end their careers or tarnish their legacies? You look at Liz Cheney, who just for pursuing principle, not only was removed from GOP leadership, where she was number 3, probably would have been Speaker of the House one day, but essentially removed from the entire Congress because of one thing, not because she wasn't conservative enough. She was the most conservative member of the House of Representatives, according to the Heritage Foundation. She pursued principle, and look at what happened. So you can imagine, why do any of my colleagues look at that and say, whoa, I'm going to try to do the same thing? By the way, there's a wonderful book about Hubert Humphrey out right now that tells the same remarkable story of a young Minneapolis mayor who was counseled to not get in front of his party in 1948 in Philadelphia and exclaim that it was time for them to get out of the shadow of states' rights into the bright light of human rights. He was counseled that if he took those 10 minutes and made that case, that his career was over. And when you think of that trembling hand, he trembled a lot before he issued that speech, but it actually created his entire career. There would be no Hubert Humphrey, who became senator and vice president and almost president, if he didn't show that courage to speak the truth to a party that was not ready to hear it. The absence of that kind of courage in politics right now is dangerous. And I think something that we should all be speaking about. I see the potential in many of my colleagues, but I also see the fear. And that is part of what I call the angertainment problem. And people are holding people accountable, frankly, for what they want to hear, not what they need to hear.
Let's talk about fear for a second. What percentage of your colleagues do you assess as being fearful to be in a crowd in a situation where politics is the venue?
I would argue a majority. It's hard. It's hard when we have a system that attacks you for being honest, that catches you misstating one word, that can be career-ending. That's something that we have to reckon with as a culture. I understand why people would be fearful. I ran against a guy in 2018, Eric Paulson, who was notorious for being a good guy, a decent guy, a relatively moderate guy, but who did not want to show up in front of people. He was part of GOP leadership. I think he was conscientious of wanting to say the truth, but knowing that in those forms it would be too complicated. I use that as my mechanism to win election. I did an ad that featured Bigfoot, of all people, to try to find Eric Paulson. So I understand, and I think it is part of the problem. By the way, a lot of my colleagues are scared for their safety right now. Increasingly, my Republican colleagues who are more fearful of angry Trumpers than they are of Democrats. I know friends that have retired from Congress, good conservative members of Congress who've retired rather than subject their family to the threats and to the fear. Many of my Democratic colleagues, of course, are facing the same. So they're fearful of having to be shamed for telling the truth. They're also fearful for their safety, and they're human beings. And if there's no other lesson I've learned in Congress so far, is that every one of us, whether it's the president to House leadership, Senate leadership, every one of us is a human being, and we're fallible. We have good days, we have bad days, and we have fears. And I think we should provide a little bit more space and place for humanity on both sides of the aisle.
I know Liz Cheney extremely well. Been friends with her for a long time. Worked for her father in the White House, in part. Ran a campaign for John McCain against Mitt Romney, who's a pretty buttoned up guy. Both Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney lost it at the people that they correctly held responsible for inciting this madness on January 6th, that you're there. And so you are probably a better person than I am, A, and B, being from Minnesota, and Minnesota nice. I'm from New Jersey.
No such thing.
I don't know how I could conceivably restrain myself if I was a member of Congress from commenting in a way that may not make my kids proud, right? If I hear a Republican member worrying about the safety of their personage in the district from the chaos that they've let loose. And I'm just wondering, when you are around these people in close proximity against what I know is the fierceness of your convictions, the depth of your patriotism, how do you keep the contempt from boiling over? How do you even function in
not
the
easily
institution?
Not easily, and it's a daily struggle, I think, for many of us. There's no question. In fact, I was in the House chamber on January 6th, trapped with about 20 colleagues in the gallery. Most of those on the floor escaped. We faced about 15 to 20 minutes where we really did think, Steve, that it was the end. Didn't know at that time that they weren't all armed and pursuing us distinctly. Assumed they were. And my colleagues in tears, making calls and texting home to say goodbye. It was a horrifying experience for 15 minutes. Anybody who's been through trauma of any kind, I have empathy for, particularly those who believe that their lives are coming to a close. And when we got out of the chamber and escaped to a safe place, I was with Liz Cheney and a bunch of Republicans and Democrats when Trump came on TV. And Liz Cheney pointed to the TV and said, he's responsible. It's time we hold him to account. And Steve, there were accolades, there were applause, there was unanimity in a way that I literally have not experienced in Congress since and never had before, where we just simply felt aligned. And it was a beautiful, memorable moment. And I look now to what happened to her, to Adam Kinzinger, to others, the 10 that voted to impeach him, where he was surely guilty. I think 9 of them are gone now, 9. Few of them on their own accord, more of them removed by primaries. And that alone makes it harder, not just the lack of principle sometimes that I have to confront, but to know that the people that had the courage weren't supported, weren't protected, weren't defended. You know, that to me is more heartbreaking, more dangerous, and more consequential than just about anything. And now, with all that said, Steve, you know, we can't choose our families, we can't choose our coworkers. And, you know, damn, I'm elected to do a job. If I don't meet people in the middle, if I don't find the humanity in everybody, it makes it impossible. And that's my job on foreign affairs too. I've got to sit with world leaders and representatives of governments that are not good people, that don't treat their people with respect. Some of them even kill them. It's not comfortable, it's not easy, and it's incompatible, incongruent with my principles. But in democracy, we got to do a job. And I find every day the courage to do that. And I got to tell you, the Problem Solvers Caucus is a remarkable table at which we don't just sit together, we open our hearts together. And after January 6th, we had challenges. We had to sit down as a family of Democrats and Republicans, share our perspective, be forthright and honest. And that's what you do. And if you do that, at least you can find some common ground. You can grant some forgiveness. It doesn't always make it easy, but at least it provides some space for humanity. There are some on the other side of the aisle that I cannot stand, that I detest, that I think are dangerous to our country and frankly, the world. But the overwhelming majority of my GOP colleagues, despite my disappointment in them, I have a responsibility and I'm going to pursue it. But damn, it's hard sometimes. It's hard sometimes.
What's the demarcation line, right? What's the disappointment line, right? I'll give you somebody, you know, that I know, you know, I'll put in my disappointment category is Lamar Alexander, somebody that I worked for, very decent human being, but did not rise to the level of his potential, really in a career of public service, right? You know, so he's the youngest governor in Tennessee history in 1982. But really, right, you know, what Lamar Alexander's starring role, so to speak, was that he passed up was this vacant moment in 2016 to 2020 where, you know, we have a combination of people who get the taste of sedition on their tongue and like it, and people who become wallflowers as the extremism, you know, rises all around them, and a very, very few, you know, who become lions in the moment in defense of all of this stuff. And I guess, like, what percentage of these people for you are on that disappointment side of the line versus the threat side of the line? I mean, what is the threat? Is it 20%, 25, 30% of them? How do you think about that?
In my estimation, Steve, there are probably a dozen House members that I think are incompetent and dangerous, sometimes by ignorance, sometimes by intention. But I would say that makes, you know, 90-some% in the category of somewhat disappointed. And by the way, look, like friends and family and people we care deeply about, we can be disappointed in them for a whole host of reasons. But doesn't mean it has to end the relationship, doesn't mean that you condemn them forever. But that's probably the right ratio. In the Senate, I mean, it's got to be the same. What startles me, and shocks me is it's sometimes the best educated, the most pedigreed people who are the most disappointing, and frankly, who are the most threatening because they're using those platforms, that experience, in remarkably savvy, intentional, and I think very dangerous ways. And I think they know who they are, and you know who they are. And at the end of the day, it's also leadership. Kevin McCarthy came to the floor and essentially held Trump accountable, only to go to Mar-a-Lago soon thereafter and kiss the ring. That's sad, and that's dangerous. And to your point, there are a lack of lions, and we need them. We need them now. I also have to say this, though, when you face these moments of, if I speak the truth, and I know that's removal or losing an election, you have a choice to make. Is it better to still be at the table? I think about Dr. Birx. I think about Anthony Fauci. I think about others who served in the last administration at that table, people who probably knew it was not in their best interest, professionally, personally, or otherwise, reputationally, to sit on that cabinet, to sit in that administration. I think some actually chose to do so for the right reasons, and history probably won't recognize that. So I do understand why sometimes you have to plug the nose or bite the tongue and do the things that are sometimes uncomfortable. But the pervasiveness of this, and the fact that it frankly could have been prevented if, and this should be the basis of this whole conversation, there would be no Trumpism if Americans felt heard, if they felt appreciated, if they felt their issues were being addressed, and if they felt they had access. And every damn one of my colleagues, because of the system, not their fault, because of the system, has to spend 10,000 hours per week collectively raising money. And from whom do you raise money? People that have it. So is it surprising that the overwhelming majority of people throughout this country, really good people of all kinds of politics, are disappointed and disgusted? And then they see news about Santos and about Menendez and corruption and bribery and a lack of principle. I understand why they think the whole place is broken. And as someone who's trying to restore that faith and sees it so clearly, there are some foundational things we could change, we should have changed. And I hold, frankly, past administrations, past members of Congress, past leaders in Congress as accountable, because I feel they weren't doing their fundamental jobs of listening and representing people who are really, really angry right now. And I don't want to dismiss that anger of Trumpism. Many Trumpers voted for Barack Obama, for goodness sakes. They may have voted for Bernie Sanders had he been the nominee. They want somebody to burn the place down. And I'm not surprised that some of my colleagues buy into that they're doing it right now, Steve. They're burning the place down because that's the culture of this movement right now. It's a culture of anger. So yes, I'm disappointed now. I'm probably even more disappointed in past leaders who were in their suits on national TV every night in Washington, D.C. and didn't spend enough darn time at home listening, learning, and representing. And that, to me, is the foundational reason that we're facing this quagmire in which we find ourselves.
100 years ago, 1923, Warren Harding has a heart attack in San Francisco. When he dies, he's the most popular president the country's ever had at the moment of his death, with the possible exception of George Washington. Mm-hmm. It's the Roaring 20s, right? The French call it the infall, the crazy years. That is not the case in Germany. 1920s are angry years. And I think, and I've called this decade the angry 20s. Are we living in Weimar America?
I sure as heck hope not. But I think the analogy is a very important one to make, because that anger is, I think, the same. The scapegoating of a people, in this case, anti-Semitism, racism, the fact that that's rising, I think, is congruent with what we saw in that era in Germany. We saw a country that felt disenfranchised, unappreciated, unheard, kind of shamed, and the other. And I think that's how a lot of Americans feel right now. And I do not want to shame them. That's a natural human feeling. And we, elected officials, have a responsibility to listen to them, to prevent what happened in Germany, Never have we ever seen a country, a democratic nation, move from relative principle into authoritarianism and to dictatorship of such horrors that were Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. So if we don't look at that, if we're not students of history and recognize that we still have time, but if we don't do something, that anger is only going to metastasize. It won't be unique to one party or the other, and it will spread geographically and otherwise. And I'm concerned. I don't want to say I'm concerned about what Germany became in the 1930s and what they did to the world. But sure, I'm concerned about our democracy, about our integrity, about our unity, about the very things that George Washington warned us about. So I wish we'd be mindful of that. And I do believe, and this is the good news, Steve, it's untold, it's underappreciated, unrecognized, but most members of Congress, despite their policy differences, despite disappointment sometimes and the unwillingness to be principled, overwhelmingly decent people. Most of the country will not know who they are because we only reward the troublemakers, the bombastic, the dividers. But I do want people to know, whether it's the 64 at the problem solvers table, whether it's the overwhelming majority of people from around the country. I do think we all want the same things. I think we have a reward system that's perverse. And I think we have too many people too focused on winning the next election and not focused enough on really listening to people. Democrats have to get out into rural America and really intentionally listen. Republicans have to spend a little bit of time in suburban and urban America and understand what we face in suburban, urban America, and recognize that we have shared problems that require shared solutions. And we have a shared obligation to prevent, God forbid, another civil war, to prevent the erosion of national integrity and unity. It's not rocket science. It's pretty darn human. And we have time, but we got to get to it. And I'm grateful that I do have some colleagues that I think I can count on both sides to bring us there.
I want to talk about generational change in this country. How do you think about it?
Well, I'm 54 years old, and I'm about 3 years younger than the median age in the United States House. I'm a youngin'. I think that number is 65 years old in the Senate. And I'm not ageist. Generational change is one thing, but what I really care about is generational diversity, because back to our founders, the People's House in particular is supposed to be as representational of the United States of America as humanly possible. And we're not. And not only that, Steve, we are not populated with people with the competencies that we need to address some really important issues today, many of them based on high-tech, hard-to-understand concepts that require either engineers, coders, and people in generations that have much better holistic understanding of these challenges: artificial intelligence, fintech, climate change. There are some issues that really require younger people in perspective. So I'm not saying we should have a Congress that's all 28 and 32 years old, but I'm saying is that we have too many people who make a long career out of something that should be short-term, should be service-oriented, and not a lifelong profession. And when you're here 30, 40 years, I think that does two things: prevents a younger generation and the best and brightest of Americans from even finding space and place to participate. And it generates complacency because we're human. And that's why I do favor, I know I'm an outlier as a Democrat, but I favor term limits because I think that would help. And then lastly, most importantly, Steve, I see how my colleagues vote, interact, position themselves, and communicate when their career or their tenure is coming to an end. And that independence, John McCain was a perfect example of that. Perfect example, I think, when he gave the thumbs down to the ACA repeal, when he knew his career was coming to an end. He did something bold, courageous. Would he have done so if he was going to serve another 6 years? I don't know. But I see behavior like that from so many who are liberated when they know that they don't have to stand for re-election. And I think we should develop a culture and invest in that kind of culture. And I think the only way to do so is by limiting terms. You know, to have at least a third of the United States Congress that would be free to do what's best for the country, not what's best for their careers.
I never would have underestimated John's capacity to figure out how to give a middle finger on the floor of the United States Senate. That was very well earned, and it will be remembered for a long time. I want to just Do you ever look at the generational change issue through the lens of it being a moral proposition?
That's a good question. It hasn't been asked in that way before, but I do believe so. Yes, it should be looked at through that lens. It should be looked at through the lens of representation. By the way, I think it should be looked at first and foremost through the lens of participation. The generations that we most need to engage, the most need to be inspired to serve the public, are the very generations we're talking about. And like anything else, if you don't have an interest, exposure, ambition at early stages of your life, it's harder to capture public servants well into their careers. So I think it's a moral imperative that we engage young people. We invest in civic education, which has been diminished and disappointingly so, I think, now for many generations. I'm working on a lot of plans right now, Steve, relative to national service propositions. How do we not just inspire military service, but Peace Corps, AmeriCorps? How do we, if not mandate, because I think that would be hard, how do we encourage, inspire, reward young people who wish to take a year before they enter the workforce and serve our nation in some way, shape, or form? That is also a moral imperative. I look to countries that are doing that right now. They're more cohesive, they're more connected, they're more unified, and they're more patriotic. And I think that is another obligation of ours. And I think the youngest member of the House right now is Maxwell Frost. I think he's in his late 20s. And it'll take him some time to get up to total speed. He's a remarkably talented young man at that age. I sure as heck could have served in Congress when I was in my late 20s. But I think just from a purely representational perspective, we have to have more young people in Congress to make their cases, to do the listening, to introduce and inject into Congress some 21st century thinking. And frankly, socially, I have to say, I think the social design of Congress is flawed. The organizational design is surely flawed. And the physical design of Congress is flawed. The social design would be improved with a younger generation, at least enough of the younger generation being participants. And we need it. And we should open those doors. And lastly, when you have to raise 10, 15, $20 million to run for the United States Congress and do it every 2 years, if you don't think that's too big of a barrier to entry to even the best and brightest middle-aged folks, let alone young people, how in the world can they approach something like that? So I think we've got to really take a good hard look at how we finance campaigns, the barriers to entry, and both parties, by the way. We need young conservatives, we need young progressives, and we should be talking more about that, because if we don't, we're going to be turning over the keys to the very people who inspired me to get in this business in the first place.
Last night, President was at a fundraiser, and there's a pool report from the fundraiser that's written by Alex Thompson at Axios. And the pool report details the president's remarks. The president gets up and he tells the story about what induced him to run for president, which is the Charleston massacre, and says a few more words. And then he almost verbatim tells that story again in front of a crowded room. There's the incident where he walks off the set. There is the reality of the shortened steps on Air Force One. There is a constancy of befuddlements that are real. And then, apart from it, and no doubt unfair, but reality, $1 billion propaganda effort has had its impact. It's scored. They've run up the score. You have a huge percentage of the country that says he's unable to run, shouldn't run, doesn't want him to run. And the results right now, 7 years on from when Trump came down the escalator, despite all the damage, is looking out at a race where Trump is ahead. Mm-hmm. And so I like to think I know what I'm talking about in a presidential race. I believe James Carville knows what he's talking about. And you said right now, the reality is that President Biden would be an underdog in this race. So I just want to put a period on that for a second. I was a moderate New Jersey Republican. I could have been a Clinton Democrat. I was a child of the 80s. And so my first election, I voted for George Herbert Walker Bush, right? And I wasn't alone. At the University of Delaware, overwhelming majority in 1988 of 18-year-olds voted for the Republican candidate, though that may be right somewhat unthinkable in recent eras. That party, right, the party that Horace Greeley, as it was founded, so this will be the greatest party of freedom that's ever been. The party of James Garfield and Teddy Roosevelt, it's gone, right? It's gone. It's something that's been taken from me, right? And something that, as a life experience, almost every person I ever worked with in politics abdicated the principles that I thought we shared, right? To a person. What does the Democratic Party mean to you? What should it stand for? Talk about your feelings for the party. To me, I loved the Republican Party, but it was insignificant to me against the country and the country's interests. It was meaningless to me. John Kennedy talked about this. What's the purpose of a party if it's not to advance a great national interest? So for me, when it detached from that, it died. It died in my heart. But what does the Democratic Party mean to you? What does it stand for? How does it attach itself to you emotionally?
Let me back up to my very beginnings, which is losing my father, Captain Artie Peffer, in the Vietnam War. I was 6 months old. He took an ROTC scholarship because he couldn't afford college. His father died when he was a little boy. My grandma Ruth worked at a department store to try to make ends meet. And he was sent to Vietnam as a captain in the Army and died in a helicopter crash in Pleiku just when I was 6 months old. My mom was widowed, 24. We lived with my great-grandparents for about 2.5 years in St. Paul. And that's how my life began. I was adopted then into a remarkable family by an amazing father, Eddie Phillips, who raised me. And I was raised in a family that told me a lot about anti-Semitism in Minneapolis, which was a hotbed of racism and anti-Semitism in the mid-century. And they were passionate, devoted supporters of Hubert Humphrey. And I listened to their stories, how this young mayor came into the city and set up a human rights commission, stood up for the people that were voiceless, powerless. And they told me stories of course, World War II and the Holocaust and how it was President Roosevelt that ultimately, although of course late, came to the rescue. And in 1980, Steve, I was 11 years old. I went to school one morning, and who shows up to speak at our assembly but John Anderson, who I didn't know at the time. All I knew, he was running for president. And he spoke to us, and I remember two things he talked about: the need for independence in our politics. Of course, he was a Republican from Illinois running as an independent. And he talked about money in politics that day, none of which meant a lot to me at the time. I went to dinner that night in Minneapolis with my grandparents and my great-grandparents, my parents. My grandmother was the advice columnist, Dear Abby. And I remember telling her that evening at dinner that this man who's going to win the presidency came to speak to us. And she reminded me that if he was speaking to a bunch of 11-year-olds, he probably wasn't going to win, which she was right. But she stopped and she said, "Are you a Democrat or Republican?" And I said, "Grandma, I'm 11. I don't even know what they are." And she said, "You're a Democrat." And she explained to me why, using Humphrey and using standing up for the underdog, fighting for people's rights and equality. And at that time, it was both persuasive. It was almost like a religion in my family. And that's why I became a Democrat. And then the more I discovered, the more I read about Humphrey, the more I learned about the roots, the more that I discovered that Hubert Humphrey converted the Democratic Party for one that was horrifically racist, when I saw that a single man's act of courage in his early 30s could literally change a party, literally in a 10-minute speech, change the Democratic Party, really inspired me. And of course, grew up celebrating Kennedy and the like, despite coming from a business family, one that really recognized that you can be pro-business and pro-labor. They're not mutually exclusive, they're mutually mandatory. So that's kind of I share that in the context of that's my upbringing. And I believe that both parties, I think it's fair to say, particularly the Republican Party, has lost its way. I think the Democratic Party still embodies many of those values. I don't think they're expressed in policies and approaches in the way that I think we could and should. I don't think we accommodate perspectives and issues and people who have a lot to share. And I think it's time for both parties to assess that. And that's why I do argue that competition is good. Competition might be the only thing that forced both parties to have a little bit of a reckoning. I'm a proud Democrat. I come from a state in which we're the only state that has the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Farmers and laborers not usually voting Democratic anymore. But it's this nature of still trying to look out for people who are struggling, to really give them voice, to listen intently. And I still believe in that really deeply. I also believe in a lot of conservative principles, which is why I think many feel homeless right now. You can be socially compassionate and fiscally responsible and wonder, where's my home? And I'd like to inject some of those conservative principles into the Democratic Party. When I say conservative principles about our defense, our foreign policy, our fiscal responsibility, how we create a budget, how we spend, how we hold people accountable. I'd like to see the Republican Party embrace a little bit more of the compassion and the decency that I think is necessary for both parties to use as their foundation. So I'll close with this. I work on democratic messaging. I sit at the leadership table on the DPCC, the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. Our charge is to message and distribute our perspectives. And I'll confess that when people ask, what is a Republican? It's pretty easy to say, small government, low taxes, strong national defense, states' rights, can name a few words. For a Democrat, if you ask them the same question, it could be paragraphs to describe what it means. And as a branding guy, Steve, until a brand is easy to recognize, easy to understand, both visually and in articulation, it's hard to build it, and it's hard to share it, and it's hard to succeed. And that's why I think that's why actually Democrats aren't doing better electorally right now than we are, even when facing somebody like Donald Trump. So that's a long-winded answer to a really even longer question, but that's my take.
I have my final question coming up, but I want to share a story with you. I did not know that your father was a military officer who had been killed in action. Have you been to Vietnam?
Steve, in fact, I'm glad you asked, because I went for the first time this year, and I got to visit the very site in which he took his last breath. And sounds kind of strange to say, but I really got to take my first breath at this age. And it was an extraordinary experience, not just to visit the place where my dad died, but I have to say, to experience the hospitality, the forgiveness, the friendship of the Vietnamese people, the very people. Huh? Extraordinary. And something that I wish more Americans could experience, a culture of forgiveness and decency and friendship and hospitality that changed me, changed my perspective on our foreign policy, changed my perspective on humanity, inspired me to ensure that young boys and girls who've lost their moms and dads in Iraq, Afghanistan, someday can also go back to their countries and perhaps experience the same feeling that I felt, which is that reconciliation is always possible. And frankly, if the Vietnamese can forgive us, Democrats and Republicans can also forgive one another and move to the future. And I think that that had a profound effect on me.
The story I was going to tell you is this. So John McCain, not widely known, but John was the chaplain for the POWs.
Wow.
And the POWs, as you know, were horrendously tortured. And then two of them, John McCain and Pete Peterson, who becomes the ambassador, the first American ambassador to Vietnam, along with Senator Kerry, play a leading role with Bill Clinton. Warriors, a president who did not serve, in leading to a reconciliation between the two countries. And so reconciliation at a core level was an important theme over and over again in John's life. And he had a relationship with Mo Udall, the famous Democratic presidential candidate multiple times. And as Mo Udall of Arizona in his later years was dying, John McCain of the opposite party would go to, it was either, I think it was Walter Reed, and would read to him at his bedside. And John loved to tell Mo Udall stories. And one of his favorite was from New Hampshire, and it was the story of Mo Udall walking into a barbershop. And Mo Udall walks into this barbershop, and he says to the barber and the three customers, "Hi, I'm Mo Udall, and I'm running for president." And the barber looks at him and says, "Yeah," he goes, "we were just laughing about that," before he walked in. I think if you went to the state of New Hampshire and you said, "I'm Dean Phillips and I'm running for president. I'm seeking to become the Democratic nominee," there would be a lot of people screaming in Washington and a lot of people cheering in other parts of the country. Are you thinking about it? And if you're not, why not, given everything that you said today?
Yeah, I am thinking about it. I haven't ruled it out. I think it's a steep slope, you know that. I think there are people who are more proximate, better prepared to campaign with national organization, national name recognition, which I do not possess. But I do feel strongly, and I have a conviction that it's important for democracy to have choices, to have competition, particularly in light of what I'm reading, the polling, the data, and what I'm sensing in my own intuition. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned that there is no alternative. I'm concerned that something could happen between now and next November that would make the Democratic Convention in Chicago an unmitigated disaster. And for a party that is acting as the adults in the room, thank goodness, I'm concerned that we are not as it relates to our electoral strategy. So I'm considering it. I do still think there's some time for somebody to enter. I'm still encouraging others who I think are better prepared right now to run a great campaign. But I have thought about it, and I recognize there'd be laughter, there'd be distaste, there would be disgust amongst many. But I also have that sense that the country is begging for alternatives. You know, whether that's me, whether it's somebody else, time will tell. But I think it's important that somebody recognize that this is the time. Don't wait till 2028. My goodness, serve your country now when we need you. That's my message. And I love campaigning. I love people. I love listening. Boy, if I became president at some point, Steve, I'd have a bipartisan cabinet. I would host dinners at the White House every month with randomly selected Americans from all around the country of all politics and backgrounds to just listen to them, not just host state dinners and tuxedos, but to host Americans in their White House, to not just talk bipartisanship, but to engage in a bipartisan basis. There are so many ways to ensure that everybody's invited, to ensure that representation began with listening, and to steer this country in a much different path. Now, whether that message would resonate with Democrats is another question. I surely believe it would resonate with just about every American outside of the hardcore Dems and Republicans, but these are things on my mind. And at the end of the day, I have to say this, you know, Joe Biden always says, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. You know, if it is Joe Biden against Donald Trump, my goodness, I mean, it's a no-brainer. I'll do everything I can to ensure that he stands the best chance to be reelected. There is no question. The alternative is horrifying. But that's also why in a head-to-head matchup, Nikki Haley outperforms Biden beyond the margin of error because it demonstrates that most of the country is also tired of Donald Trump. By the way, they're only 3 or 4 years apart in age. Trump is dangerous to the country. The thing that Biden is suffering from, unfortunately, right now is something he can't change. And there's some wisdom in him that is quite remarkable and that I honor. But I also know what the country's asking for, and how can you ignore the numbers you see in a country that prides itself on representational democracy? That's how I see it. So we'll see. I think it's unlikely, but not impossible.
Congressman Dean Phillips, the gentleman from the 3rd District of Minnesota, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Keep the faith.
Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you never miss a video. Also, for more content just like this, please consider joining our Warning Premium community. You can find out more in the description below.